You said this morning that when we were talking about the story about the Oregon health care reform, the old woman in the air conditioner, you said, but why would they write this story? It's not news, right? So how do you define news for your purposes? Seems like a simple question, but it's an important one. By the time it happens. Okay, okay.
So you make news will be part of your article in the future? Yes, it's like idea. Yeah, or what do you mean news?
No, Natalia legitimately questioned that story and said, why would they write this story now? There's no news in it. There's nothing new in it. And so what I'm really curious about is how many of you define news and the stories that you think are the right stories to pursue based on the fact that they happened today or yesterday. You can get most information without journalists these days about what just happened. Now, if there's a big demonstration, obviously, on the streets, the journalist needs to be there. But the kind of news that used to rule what most journalism was, I think we have to push way beyond that, because what we have to own are the right questions, not just exclusive timing. This is how I think about it. The old definition of news, very simply, was what happened, right? What happened today or yesterday. And I think what news really is, in our era, should be defined as what is happening. I'm just talking about, that's how you report a story. I'm just talking about the finding a way to give yourself permission and the obligation to not just be reactive. I'm obviously having trouble with my markers today. Do you know the term reactive? Right? You react to an event. And that's what the press did for most of its history. It reacted to events, and then it told people about them, right? And I'm fascinated by what you're all trying to do in this part of the world with journalism, because the more we react to events as journalists and leave it at that, the more other people get to control what those stories say. You're giving the public officials and the rich people and the people who have access to you the chance to control the agenda. And I think what journalism needs to be going forward is proactive, where we're figuring out what the core questions are on behalf of the public that need answering, and we turn that into news because that helps people understand what is happening. So you also raised the question, which was fascinating, about, well, the old woman didn't die. So why is that news? Well, the old woman is dying, right? And she's in a healthcare system that might abandon her. And so to wait until she dies and say, well, that's news, doesn't allow anybody to do anything about it. There's a term in the United States that we call mobilizing information, where one of the roles of the press is to give people information that allows them to take action to make their society better. Failing that, all we're doing is passing along what the officials want us to pass along. So we almost become stenographers, do you know that term? Secretaries. And I think the more that the internet becomes its own robust information provider, the more we need to control and own the intelligent insight that allows us to ask the right questions and provide information to people that helps them make decisions about making their lives better, helps them push back against the government, helps them buy better consumer products, helps them understand that there might be solutions, helps them know how to build a successful business. I mean, what you're talking about, Some of you have said doing positive stories like that, well, people are going to think those are promotional advertisement stories. It is a very strong tradition in the U.S. business press to do stories of successful businesses because they show the components of what it takes to put together a successful business, which means it becomes very useful journalism for anybody who wants to build a business. Or for me, the consumer, who wants to decide if I want to buy this company's product because I only want to buy a product from a company that's going to survive and back that product up. All of that fits into the rubric of journalism. When I first started out in journalism, I don't know if this is this way for you, Rob, but what I saw the press was very good at was doing a day one story, which was covering an event. And the event could be a press conference, it could be a public meeting, it could be a demonstration, it could be an announcement of some sort. We're very good at doing this. It could be a murder, right? It could be a plane crash. Something happened, we went and we covered it. And we were very good at covering the day two story, which was the reaction to the event. Okay, this happened. Now let's go ask people what they thought about it. The government just passed a tax on soda. That's an event. Let's go ask Coca-Cola and Pepsi what they think about that. Or let's go ask the family with 7 kids who all love soda and now can't afford to buy it for them because the taxes are so high, what they think about it. So this was our world. And for some journalists, it still is. But it's a very limited world. It's a very limited world. Because the truth is, the best stories live in between, and they are informed by these things, but they don't stop there. Is that making sense? Okay. And what I want to do is challenge you to try to spend more of your thinking and come up with more of your questions and your curiosity and your ideas and your possibilities for stories in this world here. So the event simply becomes a source of curiosity that opens the door. It's almost a doorway to all this other stuff. And the reaction goes way beyond the usual suspects, the usual sources, and starts to include all kinds of other people who might be affected by that event, or might want to know about it, or might have a perspective on it. I can go onto a website for any government agency that serves me and find out anything I need to know about what they've done or what they're doing. What I need is that journalist who has knowledge about what it means in my life, how the political power played out. I can go online to Amazon and buy any product I want. What I need is the journalist to tell me the story about how Amazon is literally changing the retail landscape in the United States. And that has huge implications for me, the consumer, and the citizen, because Amazon doesn't pay many taxes. So it's this huge, huge retail store that's undercutting the amount of taxes that business pays, which means I, the individual homeowner, my taxes go up. I need somebody to help me figure that out, because Amazon's not going to tell me that. They're just not, right? Jeff Bezos doesn't like the press, so he doesn't talk. He's the head of Amazon. He's kind of a jerk. He's a very rich jerk and a very smart jerk, but he is a jerk. I happen to know his best friend from high school, who's a sweetheart, but also admits Jeff Bezos is a jerk. And he's a real jerk to the press. I can go online or go to any Starbucks store in the world and figure out what Starbucks is selling me. They even now tell me how many calories that latte I consume is going to be. I can see the new products they come out with. But Starbucks isn't going to tell me that it went to war to keep somebody from buying a competing coffee company in Seattle because it wants to completely monopolize the market so it can set all the prices. That's what the journalist needs to figure out and tell me. So the future that we own, I think, is not an information future. I think it's a knowledge future and a curiosity future. And we don't have 5 hours, which means we have to have strategies for coming up with ideas that are ambitious and broad very quickly, and that suit our markets and our ability to go after them. Okay? I want to show you one other thing, and then we're going to do a little work. So, event reaction and everything else. Everything that this suggests is where you need to go. The other thing I like to think about is that all stories, and I mean any story in the world, comes from one of two places. It either comes from an event, a news event, something happened, and you take that event and you create as many possible stories out of that event as you can. A lot of you have wrestled with the pieces that Rob has shown you because they don't answer all your questions. Andre pointed out this morning, well, that story about the healthcare doesn't get into, the failure of the system. No one journalism story can answer all your questions. What you need to realize is every story is actually hundreds of stories waiting to be done, which means you have no end of cool stuff you can write about and learn. So when you judge one story and say, well, it's missing this and it's missing this, my challenge back to you is then go do that story. And then when it's missing the next piece, go do the next story. So small event, small news story opens itself up to all kinds of possibilities. And the other way ideas and stories happen is you have a topic or an idea. Big topic, big idea, a concept. You know the term concept, right? A notion. Homelessness is a concept, a topic. Taxation is a topic. The shadow economy is a topic. It's not an event. But in the same way, a small event can be turned into bigger thinking and bigger possibilities. Topics and ideas can be peeled down to hundreds and dozens of little stories, each one having the potential to illustrate that topic or idea. The Oregon healthcare story was a big topic and issue that was peeled down to one 90-year-old woman without an air conditioner. And that revealed one aspect of this topic. If you do anything in between, your stories are going to be too mushy and broad, and they're not really going to say much of anything. They're just going to be the repetition of the same stuff a lot of us already know. This is the way to hook people, is to say, there was an event and here's what it means in your life. And here's a question you might have about it. And here's the way it plays out. Here's the impact it has for certain people. And here are the power players who get involved in it. Here are the people who are winning and losing. Or you have a big issue that's ongoing, a big topic that's just constant and chronic in your society. Media ownership in the Ukraine. Well, there's a big concept and topic, huh? We chew on that one for the next 4 days, right? I have 5 rules for good brainstorming. Very simple, not scientific, and the process I'm going to show you is pretty journalistic. But here are my 5 rules for good brainstorming. First, you have to be willing, when you're just thinking about story ideas, to blue sky. Do you know what that term is as a metaphor? Blue sky thinking. Anything is possible. Anything is possible. What happens in most news organizations is we immediately start thinking about production. Will it fit? Do we have the time? Do we have the budget? Is it right for our market? You have got to separate creative thinking from the demands or the realities of production. One of the things that trips most journalists and news organizations up is they have their brainstorming or idea meetings at the same time they have their production planning meetings. Separate them. Let everything seem possible. Be as ambitious as possible, because guess what? Reality will reinsert itself. Your budget is what it is. Your space is what it is. Your time is what it is. Your staff resources are what they are. Those things will always come back. But what you want to do is give yourself 5 minutes to just believe that anything's possible and to be as wacky and creative and curious as possible. So we're going to separate those two things, which means when you do this brainstorming, you have to think constantly in questions, not solutions or answers or decisions. They have to be questions, because curiosity and questions drive more curiosity and questions, and they drive the best ideas. Ideas seldom come from directives, they come from questions. And the questions have to be really open-minded and open-hearted. They have to be, I wonder about this. What if we did this? How would we find out this? Who's curious about that? They can't be, how could we get that done? Or, do we have the money? They just have to be, what else are you curious about? What else are you curious about? What else? I have tons of curiosity about each one of the ideas you put on the table. What does it mean for this group of people? What does it cost? Who's got a stake in it? All kinds of questions. 3, believe it or not, the most creative ideas and brainstorming come out of the most disciplined formats and processes. The more you can discipline your structure for having a brainstorming meeting, the more you can come up with creative ideas, because it forces you to go deep instead of to spin all over the place. Which means you don't want to call a brainstorming session and say, let's talk about what we're going to put in the paper tomorrow. You want to call a brainstorming session and say, what are the 50 stories we could write about the Seychelles? And you stay right there. And then you get even more disciplined and you say, what are the 40 profiles we could write about the Seychelles? I was in China several years ago teaching, and it was the year before the Olympics in Beijing. And I was working with a paper in Hangzhou. And they were getting ready to send a whole bunch of, everybody in China covered the Olympics. It was crazy. It was huge for China. And we got there literally a year before the Olympics. And I said, what are you guys doing about planning the Olympics? And the Chinese have a tradition also where they cover what happened. They cover what government or officials, they respond. And I said, oh, no, you should be covering the Olympics now. And they said, well, but the Olympics hasn't happened yet. And I said, well, but it's on the calendar. You know it's going to happen. So I said, you know what we're going to do tomorrow when we get together? You've got 52 weeks to the Olympics. We're going to come up with 52 story ideas that you can do between now and the Olympics, one a week. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And the next day we went in, and I ran them through a template, and they came up with about 70 story ideas. And then they said, which ones should we do now? And I was like, just pick 52. It doesn't matter. So by getting really disciplined about that and saying, all we're going to talk about is 52 stories from the Olympics. You're not going to talk about anything else. They came up with them because you just stay there, and you get more and more and more curious. And you've got to let those questions go. You've got to honor them. Be human. The reason I had you do this little dinner table exercise is because you really need to start thinking more like the reader or like people out in their public who have curiosities that you might not. One of the habits I got into as a reporter was before I would go out on a story, I would always stop at the desk of somebody on the copy desk or in the sports department or maybe the cop reporter who was totally not interested in what I was doing. And I'd say, hey, I'm going to cover a story on this subject. What do you want to know? And they'd usually say, not a goddamn thing. Because they already knew what the story would say. And I'd say, no, seriously. If I could tell any story out of this event or by interviewing this person, what would you want to know? I'll tell you a really quick story about that. It's actually very funny and very informative. I told you yesterday I'd gone to Antarctica. I covered a dog sled expedition. And it started because a guy in Minnesota, who was from our city, had led a dog sled expedition 2 years earlier to the North Pole. 8 people, and he had done this with the support of National Geographic, and the whole goal was to prove whether or not Admiral Perry could have done the trip he said he did when he discovered the North Pole. So could you really get to the North Pole without support, without resupply, on dog sled and ski? So this guy put together this expedition. He gets 8 people together, and they go up to the North Pole. Well, I wanted to cover that story, and my editor wouldn't let me. We had a sister paper cover it, so I was cranky about it. I told you I was a brat. And so a year goes by, and the calendar comes around, and the editor comes up to me, and he says, you know that story you were really interested in? Well, it's the 1-year anniversary, and I want you to do the anniversary story. Anniversary stories are usually dogs, right? Because we don't do them in a fresh way. And I said, okay, but I want to write about Anne Bancroft, who was the only woman on the trip. There were 8 people on the trip. She was the only woman. He says, I don't care what you do, you got to do the anniversary story. And you got to do the traditional stuff, and if you want to get Anne Bancroft, that's fine. So I'm thinking, groovy, I got an excuse to write about Anne Bancroft, who I was fascinated with. The trouble is, Anne Bancroft at that point had been on the cover of 12 magazines. She had been written about and written about and written about, and the one thing she refused to talk about was being the only woman on the trip, because she didn't want to be seen as the token woman on the trip. So she literally would not answer questions from the press about being the only woman, which is what I wanted to talk to her about, right? So I arrange an interview. She's very shy. She doesn't like being talked to by the press, but she knows she has to talk to me. So I arrange an interview, and I'm getting ready to go out and talk to her. And I realize my ideas are failing, first thing on the list, because I have no idea what to ask her about, because it's all been written, and she won't talk about the one thing that hasn't. So I'm like, shit, what do I do? So I'm thinking, and I'm coming up with nothing. I'm going to talk to a woman who doesn't want to talk to me, and I got to come up with a fresh idea about nothing. I'm dry. I am dry. I even said to my boyfriend, he's a journalist, the night before, I said, God, I'm interviewing Anne Bancroft tomorrow, and I don't have a story. And he says, well, nothing bad happened to her, and you always write about people who bad things happen to. And I was like, oh, that's a problem. So the next day, as I'm going out the door, I stop at the desk of a guy named Wayne Wangstead. He was the cop reporter. Old Marine, ex-Marine, card-carrying member of the National Rifle Association. He liked to haze young women reporters who were new at the paper by putting autopsy photos of dead women murder victims in their desks to see how they'd react. Wayne was a character. Wayne called me and my cohort of young women reporters feminazis. You goddamn feminazis trying to change the world. The world was fine without you. This is a boys' world, right? So I'm like, great. So I stop by Wayne's desk and I say, Wayne, I need some help. Wayne's like, what do you want? And I said, I'm going to interview Anne Bancroft. And be curious, what do you want to know about her? What are you interested in? We had a little back and forth, and finally I said, no, Wayne, what do you care about? What are you interested in? And he said, I quote, not a goddamn thing. One of those feminazis, girls off on camping trips, who cares? It was a year ago. Who gives a shit, right? This is Wayne Wangstead. And I'm like, oh, crap. So I said, no, seriously, Wayne, let's do this. If you could have a beer with Anne Bancroft and ask her any question in the world, and get her to answer it, what would you want to ask her? And here's the deal. You don't have to ask her, I will. And he said, really? I said, any question in the world, Wayne, what would you ask her? And he said, put it in writing. I said, what do you mean put it in writing? Put it in writing that you'll ask her, and then sign it. I was like, what? I said, whatever. So I was like, I will ask Wayne's question, and I signed my name, I put the date on it, right? And I said, okay, what's your question? And he looks at me, very smug, and he says, I want to know how she peed. And I was like, oh, for God's sake. And he said, you got to ask. So I go off to my interview with Anne Bancroft. This is a true story. And it's not going very well. She's very reluctant to talk. She's very wary of the press. She knows where I want to go with this woman token thing. She won't go there. And finally, about an hour into it, I say, this isn't going very well, is it? And she said, it's okay. I just wonder how much longer it's going to take. And I was like, shoot. And I said, let's just take a break. And you walk your dog, and I'm going to call the office and check in, and then just another half an hour because I just need to clean up some things. But meanwhile, I got to do this weird thing that I promised a colleague back at the office I'd do. She's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, I made a bet with him about something that was going to happen with you, and I just wondered if... now she's interested, right? It's like going up to somebody and said, I had a dream about you last night, right? Nobody's going to walk away from that, right? She's like, well, what? And I said, well, it's really ridiculous. Well, what? I said, oh, it's really silly. She said, what? So I said, well, I talked to this friend, and da-da-da. He had this question, and I told him I'd ask it, and I'd get you to answer it. And she said, well, what's the question? I've got a source now who wants to play, right? And I looked at her, I said, he wants to know how you peed. And I rolled my eyes. And I figured she'd roll her eyes. And she said, God, that's the most interesting thing. I said, what? Now, I would have never asked, because I've been winter camping in the far north, and I'm a girl. I kind of know how to pee out in the woods, or at least I thought I did. Big lesson here, don't assume you know things. I said, what do you mean? And she says, well, there were 8 of us, 7 guys and me, and we were all sharing a tent. And I said, yeah. And she says, and it was 60 below. Winds were blowing 100 miles an hour. I said, yeah. And she says, and if you have to pee, you got to pee, right? I said, yeah. So, and she says, well, everybody always assumes it's easier for the men. Of course it's easier for the men to pee in the woods. They stand up, right? She said, not this case. I said, really? Why not? She says, well, because if the guys were going to pee, they'd have to go outside. And if they unzipped and went outside when it's 60 below with 100-mile-an-hour wind, do you know what flash freezing looks like? And I was like, oh, hadn't thought of that. What did they do? She says, well, we had a bucket in the corner of the tent. And for them to pee, they had to go and stand at the bucket. And I'm right there. And they're kind of embarrassed, right? And I said, so what did you do? She said, well, same bucket, but I'm wearing my anorak, long jacket down to here. She says, what I'd do is I'd saddle up to the bucket, and I'd reach under my anorak, and I'd unzip my ski pants, and I'd scooch down, and my anorak would create a little bathroom. And I'd sit there, and I'd do my business, and they'd all blush. It was great. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, and there was another thing like that. And I said, well, what's that? Turns out, at some point of the expedition, they had some problems. Somebody got hurt, and they flew 2 guys out. So now they're down to 6 people, and they have to save weight on this trip. So they peeled down, instead of each having their own sleeping bag, they peeled down to 4 sleeping bags between 6 people. And what they did was they call it double bagging. They zipped 2 bags together, and they slept 3 to a bag. And she says, so we're 3 to a bag and double bags. I said, yeah, so. And she says, well, the guys, they don't want to sleep next to each other, because you know how that looks. I said, yeah, so. And she said, which means I always got the spot in the middle, which means I had body heat on both sides of me. I said, really? She's on a roll. We spent 3 hours, and she told me everything about being the only woman on that trip, because Wayne Wangstad stopped and said, I want to know how she peed. The message here is other people's curiosity is really valuable. And it can help you think more creatively about what you might get out of people. A lot of the sources we go to, we're going to talk about this with interviewing tomorrow, we bore them. We bore them because we ask the same questions over and over and over again, and we assume the same answers. Nobody had ever asked Anne Bancroft how she peed. And she actually had a story to tell. And the only thing I was going to lose was a little bit of my pride if she just said, that's really stupid. And I'd say, okay, then let's move on, right? So, curiosity, curiosity, curiosity. All of these things, so be human. And finally, my last rule of brainstorming is no piss. We just talked about peeing. You know the word piss, right? Kind of a universal. It is a universal word, and here's where it comes from. It comes from international dog sledding. When I covered this expedition across Antarctica, there were 6 people from 6 different countries. And sled dogs are raised all over the world. And sled dogs are raised, obviously, in the language of the country in which they're raised, whether it's Greenland or Australia or Japan or the US or Chile. It had never occurred to me that sled dogs, once they're with an international team of sled dogs, have to have a shared language. They have to have Esperanto for dogs. Who knew? So all sled dogs who run as an international team are taught 5 words the same. Hup for go, wo for stop, G for right, ha for left, and no piss. No piss. Why would you teach a sled dog to understand no piss? They piss on each other. You got 8 or 10 dogs tied in traces, which is how they pull a sled. It's like the harnesses on a horse team. And they're chugging along, right? You're racing or you're pulling a sled. And one dog stops to piss. All the other dogs stop. And then they piss on each other. And then you got a dog fight on your hands. It's how most brainstorming happens. We piss on each other's ideas. We piss on the possibilities. We say we've already done that. We say we don't have the money. So the key to good brainstorming is no piss. You've got to welcome any ideas, no matter how crazy they are, no matter how wacky they seem, because all you're doing is blue sky. You'll get to this, okay? Making sense? All right, those are my rules of brainstorming. You got some handouts. We're going to very quickly, in our last 7 minutes, take this handout called 7 Paths. Now we're going to go back to journalistic genre. It's called 7 Paths plus a few side roads. And what this is a way to continue to discipline your brainstorming so in very, very quick fashion you can come up with multiple possibilities and ideas around any subject. No, this one, 7 Paths. I'll tell you what that other one is in a minute. So what this is a very brief list of typical genres of types of stories. Issue or trend stories. You're very familiar with them, right? Statistics are out there. Something's happening or ongoing in society. There's a trend. There's a bigger issue at work. Issue or trend stories are driven by a central question. And that question is, does the event of the day tie into something bigger that's going on and that's more widespread in society? Or if it's a trend story, is something changing? Is some long-time pattern changing up or down? Central questions. All good story ideas are driven by questions. Explanatory stories we've talked about. Now, explanatory stories to me aren't like dictionary stories. They're literally stories that explain to the world in story form how things work. So the central question driving them is, how does this work? How do they build a bridge in water? I live by water in Seattle, and they're building a big freeway bridge, and I keep wondering how they sink pylons deep underwater. I keep wishing my newspaper would tell me that, because I'd be interested in knowing that. How do they put pylons underwater? Like, do divers have special? I don't know how they do it. Fascinating. Profiles are driven by the question who. Who is most affected by a story? Who is the central character in a story? Who is the power player in a story? Who are the affected stakeholders in a story? Who is the person you could follow into an issue to illustrate that issue, which is what happened with the old woman in the Oregon healthcare story. She was a character who opened the door to that subject. Voices stories are driven by the question, who has insight or knowledge or perspective that I want to hear about? Another way I think of them is if you could pull together 5 or 6 of the most interesting people around one subject and let them debate it or argue it, and I could eavesdrop on their conversation, who would I want at that table? Very an interesting thing to do. Descriptive stories are driven by the question, where can I go and what can I show the reader to give them a vicarious experience that will help them understand a situation or event? But you have to go somewhere, you have to be able to describe something. Investigative stories are driven by the question, who has the power and the money and how is it being used or misused? Not all stories lend themselves to investigations, but if you don't ask that question, you're not thinking about the issue of power and money in the same way. And finally, narrative stories are driven by the question, is there a beginning, middle, end arc here that I can follow a character through a situation to reveal a universal theme, usually an emotional theme? Making sense?